The differences between the failures of the historic church and the modern church, however, is this. The historic church began to split primarily due to conflicts of tradition and applicational arguments of the Torah. Essentially, how its contents should be integrated into this New Testament way of living, or if they should be integrated at all. There isn't much, if any, historical documentation that the early church, at least not in their main arguments or issues, were concerned about finances or about business practices, mostly because the historic church wasn't really a business yet. See, this idea of the church becoming an actual functioning business, it didn't happen until much later. Now, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to imagine what ekklesia was actually like, which means church. It's a Greek word for church. What was church like during Paul's time in ministry? What was the ekklesia? What did that look like? Ekklesia literally translates to an assembly of believers. Now, as you imagine this, I want you to kind of imagine a small group, because if we were to picture the historic church, these groups of believers, in most cases, not all, these were more akin to what we would picture nowadays as a small group within a much bigger church. They were in many cases groups of believers less than 20 people. And in many cases, it was half or less than that. See, they would meet primarily inside of people's homes or out in public spaces where they could speak about Christ. And due to their small size, they were much more interactive. Similar to, like I said, a small group today. There was more conversation. It wasn't always just one person speaking at a group of people. Now, again, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to picture a church in modern time. And even better, I want you to picture a mega church. Now, your second picturing looks nothing like your first picturing, right? They're vastly different. We're talking about a small group of people, 20 or less in most cases, many times 10 or less, where it's more of a conversation, it's more of a dialogue, it's more interactive. And on the other side, you're picturing a stadium, essentially in many cases, and even if not a stadium, a very large building that has rows of seats, and it's not interactive whatsoever. It's one person up on a stage, elevated physically above the rest, speaking at a group of people. There's very little, if any, interaction between the pastor and the congregants during a church service. Now, as you picture the megachurch side of things, and you're picturing what that looks like in application, you're picturing a preacher or pastor up on a stage. He's giving what we call a sermon, right? Now, in modern times, a sermon involves no interaction between pastor and congregant. A sermon largely contains small amounts of scripture, if any, at times, and large amounts of illustrations and storytelling. Now, granted, these stories, these illustrations are meant to convey usually a message or an ideal from the Bible, but the actual use of biblical text in most modern day churches is very minimal. Now, I do want to note that obviously the Bible is full of illustrations, so I'm not trying to say anything against the way that we're giving sermons nowadays, that illustrations and storytelling is bad. Like, no, the Bible is full of stories, it's full of illustrations. But the fact that sermons today, that when you go to church today, the vast majority of what you receive from the church is that storytelling, and there's very little push on actual education of Scripture, how to read Scripture, what Scripture really says. We're almost solely and only trying to get a feel-good message across from the church to the congregants.